Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Navigating MDR Expectations for Tomorrow based on Notified Body Feedback Today. It's great to see so many of you on the webinar today, and I hope all of your family, friends and colleagues are continuing to keep safe and well. My name is Kieran Campbell. I'm a content director here at LSX Leaders based in London, and I'm delighted to be hosting today's webinar, which is the third in our medical device innovation series in partnership with McCraw. As with the first two webinars, we have a lot of our own community who are joining us today, but also a number of those from outside. So before we kick off, I wanted to briefly introduce LSX for those who don't know us. LSX stands for Life Science Executives. We are a community and network of senior life science decision makers across biotech, medtech, health tech businesses, pharma companies, the full range of the investor base in life sciences, as well as payers, providers, and other key stakeholders in the healthcare sector. Many people know us from our high-level, large-scale conferences, partnering events, and showcases that we run in Europe and the US. While these physical events are off the table for this short period, we're very pleased to continue connecting people and to share the expertise of our community through the other arm of our business, which is virtual partnering and various forms of digital content delivery, such as today's webinar. We are also delighted to be working with McCraw again for today's session, and indeed this webinar series, as a leading advisory firm and CRO for the medical device sector, with experience across regulatory, reimbursement, clinical research, healthcare compliance, and quality assurance. They're the perfect partners for this medical device series. Today, we're going to be focusing on one of these areas specifically, which is regulation. And I'll shortly be handing you over to our speakers and presenters for today. Michelle McDonough, who is a Senior Director of Regulatory and Clinical Affairs, and Mike Goodson, who's an Associate Director of Regulatory Affairs. Michelle has over 11 years of experience in regulatory and clinical affairs, leads the McCraw International Regulatory Team. Experience spans US and international regulatory affairs, clinical strategy development and implementation, clinical and regulatory writing, assessment, and strategies. Mike joined McCraw in 2017 and has over 9 years of regulatory experience with a focus in international regulatory affairs. His experience is in strategy submissions, gap analysis, technical documentation, clinical evaluation, report development, post-market clinical data collection strategy, and clinical data assessment. I'd like to ensure that we give a minute or two to allow any latecomers to join before I hand over to our speakers and our webinar listeners, who will be guiding us through today's session. So just a couple of quick points to mention from me before we kick off today. We will have the opportunity at the end of the presentation for me to put any questions you might have to Michelle and Mike, and I would encourage all of you to please make use of this time to ask any questions or follow-ups from the presentation. Please ask your question in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, and at the end of the presentation, we'll look to answer as many as we can. You can also send me any questions you may have privately in the chat function if you wish. If you see a question that you wanted to ask in the Q&A already, you can upvote for that question to show that you are also interested in the answer, and we can look to address those ones first. So please do use this function and ask any questions you have at any point throughout the session. So that's it from me, and I'll now hand you over to Michelle and Mike.
Thank you, Kieran. Hello, everyone. I'm Michelle McDonough, and I'm joined today by my coworker and co-presenter, Mike Goodson, as Kieran mentioned. We are going to be discussing the EU medical device regulation and navigating MDR expectations for tomorrow based on notified body feedback today. To start today's presentation, I'll give everyone a little bit of background on McCraw. I know Kieran's done that a little bit, but what are our services? Who are we? And then we'll dive into the substantive topics for today's presentation. The presentation format is going to walk through common gaps that we have observed through a number of client projects and notified body interactions. I do want to take a moment here and say that it is important to note that there is variability between notified bodies and even reviewers within the same notified body. There are gaps that have been identified for client A that we see sail through review for client B. And it all comes back to this gray area where notified bodies are starting to step up their expectations with the coming MDR, but there's definitely variability in those expectations right now. A lot of the requests that are going to be in here are already outlined in the MDD and the MEDEVs, but historically the level of evidence required was just lower, or there was a lack of specificity that we now have in the MDR. With that being said, this presentation is based on the information available to the public to date and the experiences Mike and I have had working with our clients and notified bodies. We fully expect that things will continue to move and shift as new guidance documents and communications are released and more interactions with notified bodies come across our desk. So finally, I want to note to the group that the slides are text heavy and it will accompany our commentary for today. But the idea behind this is that, while it may be a bit overwhelming in the presentation format, hopefully these slides can be a resource to you guys after the webinar today. Starting with a little background on MICRA. MICRA's been around 16 years now as a world-renowned medical device and biologic CRO and consulting firm. We have over 100 employees in 3 offices in Washington, D.C., Hartford, Connecticut, and New York City. However, we are all working from home at the moment. We have an experienced management team, high client retention, and we're currently batting perfect when it comes to PMA approvals. And for those of you who are familiar with the PMA application process and the amount of data and strategic writing that goes into those files, I think this one goes to show the depth and quality of our team, and 2, how this really has driven our success internationally and that global expertise, given the new requirements, especially related to clinical evidence. So we offer those integrated strategic services. In addition to the US and international regulatory affairs team that Mike and I are a part of, we are also a full service CRO, and we also have service offerings in reimbursement, manufacturing and quality systems, surgeon and corporate ethics and compliance, as well as due diligence support. So in using MICRA, you have access to integration of services and unique therapy specialization. Really what the purpose of this slide is illustrate. We have experience in orthopedics, cardiovascular, spine, biologics, just to name a few. And Karen gave some nice intros, so here they are if you want to read them again after the webinar. I also want to point out that feel free to reach out to Mike or myself if you have any questions about our services. On the last slide, there will also be information to our contact information for our business development team if you want to reach out to them related to anything you have questions about. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike, who's going to get us started on the first set of common gaps.
Thank you, everybody, for attending the webinar today. Let's just jump right into it. So by now, I'm sure everyone knows that the MDR was delayed by 1 year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. In this slide, we will highlight the actions required to be completed before the new date of application of the MDR, which is May 2021. So if you look at Article 120 of the MDR, it identifies several requirements that are needed to be put in place regardless of the expiration date of your current MDD certificate and regardless of your risk class of your device. While Article 120, specifically paragraph 3, calls out class 1 devices, these requirements that we're going to touch on in this slide are applicable to all devices regardless of risk class. With that said, these are the gaps we have seen at MICRA based on the requirements listed in Article 120 of the MDR. So the first gap is PMS requirements are not in place per Article 83. Michelle will dive deeper into these PMS requirements later in this presentation, but one example of PMS requirements not in place include demonstrating a continuous reassessment of your risk-benefit analysis, utilizing suitable indicators and threshold values. Additionally, as part of the PMS, two components we also see not in place that we at MICRA have seen get more scrutiny include vigilance and trend reporting, as noted in Article 87 and Article 88, respectively, in the MDR. The next bullet, registration of economic operators. These include your authorized rep, if applicable, your importers and distributors, and the registration of devices. These steps have not been completed per Article 29, 30, and 31 of the MDR. So it's important to note in this bullet that the exact details on what are required for this information is detailed in Section 1 of Annex 11, Part A. I also want to note that this process includes the use of Unimed, and while Unimed is currently inactive and not expected to go live until 2022, it's not entirely clear on how this will work out. So I recommend you check out the EU MDR website, which we have a link to at the bottom of this page to stay up to date. For the last gap, while it's not explicitly listed in Article 120, we commonly see Class 1 technical files that are insufficient and typically do not include a CER. I recommend that if you plan to take advantage of the Article 120 transitional provisions, you update your Class 1 technical file and ensure it has a compliant CER. So what can you do to address some of these gaps? One action is to update your appropriate PMS and vigilance procedures, including trending analysis and reporting. I recommend you review the applicable article and make sure your internal documents align with these requirements. The MDR is pretty specific on what the requirements are. So essentially you can copy and paste the requirements listed in each article into your internal procedures. Also, contracts with your economic operators should be revised and updated. These stakeholders now have additional obligations and requirements in the MDR. So you want to make sure your partners understand these requirements and can fulfill these requirements. Finally, create and update a Class 1 technical file, including ensuring it has a compliant CER. As we get into the next slide, we'll touch on the new labeling requirements for the MDR as compared to the MDD. I just want to note a couple things on this slide. These are some of the bigger gaps we at MICR have seen related more in the orthopedic, spine, and cardiovascular field related to labeling. I also want to note that these gaps are not an exhaustive list, but you should refer to Annex 1, Chapter 3 for a comprehensive list of requirements. So as we dive into these gaps, I also want to note that MICRA, we have seen most of these gaps. However, some of the other gaps listed we have not seen yet, but just we know these are coming since they are explicitly listed in the MDR. Additionally, there are some unknowns as to the expectations of the notified bodies related to these items. So as we go in through these bullets, the first one we have intended purpose. Your indication for use statement alone is not sufficient. There is a difference between intended purpose and indication for use. Also, your patient target groups are not listed, intended users are not listed. We see gaps where expected clinical benefits are not included in your labeling. Other items we have seen not included: residual risk, the reference to the summary of safety and clinical performance, and also the implant card. This is a new requirement. The Medical Device Coordination Group has recently put out a guidance detailing the requirements of this implant card. We have a link to this website towards the end of the slides. So some solutions to address gaps in your labeling. MICR recommends developing a matrix that identifies your products and their associated labeling documents, and then just do a comparison to the requirements of Annex 1, Chapter 3 of the MDR, where you can easily find gaps and then develop strategies to address those gaps. It is also recommended that the intended purpose and indications be reviewed in relation to the available clinical data you have to support those claims. For example, all indications for use, all your claims need to be supported by clinical data of your device. Finally, with all this additional content being added to labeling, it's recommended you examine the ISO standard related to medical device symbols to be used in labeling, which is EN ISO 15223. Okay. So on the next few slides, we will dive into different aspects of the clinical evaluation, which I'm sure most of you probably know. the clinical evaluation process has been getting a lot more scrutiny since the release of MedDev 2.7/1 Rev 4 in 2016. You can expect that scrutiny on CERs to continue under the MDR, since the MDR CER requirements are largely aligned with the MedDev requirement. So I will start off with discussing gaps we at MICRA commonly see, as well as what we have seen from different notified bodies related to the clinical evaluation plan, also known as the CEP. The requirements of the CEP are specifically laid out in Annex 14, Part A, subsection 1A, and Section 7 of the MedDev CER guidance. So the gaps listed below are specifically pulled from the MDR, but as I just mentioned, you can also refer to the MedDev CER guidance for a complete listing. So the first gap, the identification of the relevant GSPRs, or the general safety and performance requirements, and specification of parameters to be used to determine, based on the state-of-the-art, the acceptability for the risk-benefit ratio. Okay, so what does this mean exactly? The specification of parameters to be used are your key safety and performance outcomes. So as noted in the CEP and CER requirements of the MDR, you, the manufacturer, determine these key parameters based on your state-of-the-art of your device. So the next bullet, intended purpose and intended target groups. So noted in the prior slide, is your intended purpose identified? Is it in your CEP? This is different from your indications for use statement. Think of the intended purpose as what your device is intended to do. So if it's a bone, let's look at an easy example of a bone fixation plate and our screw. So the intended purpose is to provide fixation, while the intended indications for use dive into the exact medical conditions of why you would use this device. So perhaps it's a fracture or trauma or a tumor into the bone. Intended clinical benefits. What are the clinical benefits of your device? Why use your device? Make sure you identify these. The specification of methods to be used for examination of safety. How are you assessing the safety of your device? This is typically based on demonstrating alignment of your device's side effect acceptability and the risk documentation. Michelle will kind of dive into this later in her portion. Data appraisal and analysis plan. Your CEP should clearly identify your plan on how you want to address the data and how to appraise the data. It is recommended that the same appraisal criteria be used for all your data sources in your CER. Now, if you're unsure on what criteria to use to appraise the data, the MedDev CER guidance actually cites a few examples. One example includes the IMDRF guidance, formerly the GHTF. And then finally, the last bullet, no clinical development plan is included in your CEP. So this is a new requirement to the MDR, and the scope of your clinical development plan will likely vary based off the market status of your device, but the purpose of this plan is just to show progression from maybe preliminary or exploratory investigations, such as first-in-man studies, feasibility and pilot studies, on to further confirmatory studies, as well as your post-market clinical follow-up studies. So, solutions, how can you address some of these gaps? First step, you want to generate a clinical evaluation procedure that clearly outlines the requirements, including a plan and report requirements. So if you go to the MDR Annex 14 Part A, it lists several bullets of what's required in your plan. I recommend that these requirements are in your procedures. Next, you want to generate the clinical evaluation plan template. I also recommend having a clinical evaluation plan template separate from your CER template. You also want to make sure your template aligns with your procedure. So the requirements listed in your procedure should therefore be in your template. And then next up, finally, you want to go ahead and create your clinical evaluation plan at the time of your next CER update. It's also important to note that a new CEP will be required each time you update your CER. So now we get on to the clinical evaluation, the search portion. So one of the most common gaps we see at MICRA, and one of the most common gaps we see from notified bodies, involves the clinical literature search related to the state of the art. So reference to the state of the art appears roughly 12 times in the MDR. However, there's no definition for what state of the art means. But if you look at the MedDev guidance, the purpose of the SOA, specifically section 8.2 of the MedDev, the SOA should include applicable standards and guidance documents, data that relate to benchmark devices, critical components and medical alternatives, and details on the medical conditions and patient populations intended to be managed with the device. The SOA should also describe the clinical background and identify the current knowledge / state of the art in the corresponding medical field. So as we dive into the summary of gaps, the first one we have listed here is the formal search protocols of the state of the art are missing. So it's important here to note that we at MICRA recommend you separate your state-of-the-art data from the data of your device or the device under evaluation of the CER, so you can clearly compare that data later on, which we will touch on in the next slides. Another gap relates to the search methodology, such as the search terms, limits, date range, and providing justification for that date range. So an example for justifying a date range, you could have your start date of your search be the date your device first went on to the global market. Other gaps include not clearly defining your inclusion/exclusion criteria of articles, not identifying strategies to avoid duplicative data, your data collection plan is not defined. Also, full text of included studies are not compiled and attached to the CER. And then finally, searches are inadequate to capture data on safety and performance parameters and all therapeutic options. So here are your search terms collecting articles with extractable and quantitative data. So to address these gaps and to make sure your literature search is comprehensive and meets the MedDev requirements, you should generate the state-of-the-art outline as part of your CEP, which we just touched on in the prior slides. It's also recommended that during the CEP process, when you develop your state-of-the-art outline, you have a clinical expert and subject matter experts, such as maybe it's product development or the engineering team, provide input into the state-of-the-art. It's important these folks get involved, as you need to show you're having the right and qualified people provide input. So down the road, when you generate your reports, when they review it, they're not shocked or disagree with how the structure is. Also, you want to ensure your search terms are adequate to capture clinical safety and performance data on all alternative therapies and benchmark similar devices. Similar to the solution above, get the other folks involved in this. They can help make sure your terms are appropriate and will capture the data you're looking for. And then finally, generate templates for the literature search process. Having templates in a defined process will ensure consistency across your CERs, as well as ensure your searches are reproducible. And next slide, we'll dive into the actual Clinical Evaluation Report, or the CER. So for this slide, we're going to touch on the common gaps we see in the CER. So this is just the output of your CEP or your plan. You'll notice some overlap between the CEP gaps and the gaps of the CER. So if you think about it, if you have gaps in your plan, your output, i.e. the CER, will also have gaps. So to reiterate a point on the prior slides, it's important your plan is reviewed by the additional and appropriate people to ensure your plan is addressing the appropriate objectives, and you're going to meet all the requirements laid out in the MDR and the MedDev guidance. So a summary of the gaps. Not identifying the appropriate GSPR. So this was on the CEP gap as well. So as I mentioned, if your CEP is insufficient, so will your CER. Next gap, not appraising your data sources, specifically not appraising each data source. So your CER is likely to have both clinical and non-clinical data sources. Since you are using a variety of sources, each source should be appraised individually based on your appraisal method you identify in your CEP. Next gap, the SOA search methodology and comparison to the subject device is lacking. So comparisons should be made to conservative treatments, medicinal, and surgical or invasive treatment options. Finally, appropriate evaluators, signatures, declarations of interest, and the CER update frequency are not included in the CER. So again, it's important that these reviewers are involved early on, as if they are involved too late, they could have maybe difference of opinion on what the CER can look like, and then delay or cause a lot of rework. So some solutions: generate a template for the CER. Similar to generating a CEP template, you should also develop a CER template. You should also ensure your CER demonstrates clearly how each data source meets the relevant GSPRs and ensure each data source is appraised. You also want to ensure your CER includes a comparison of, let's say, your device or the subject device to that of the state-of-the-art. The data for your device should be compared to other alternative treatment options. We do have an example on the next slide of a method that can be used to demonstrate this. And then finally, a document review of identified risks compared to the risk documentation and labeling. So for example, are all identified risks from the clinical data captured in your risk and labeling? The notified bodies here are looking for alignment across these documents. So as I mentioned, one potential method to demonstrate consistency of the subject device to that of the state-of-the-art, so comparing it to alternative treatments, could include, maybe a tabular summary of those key performance and safety parameters we talked about earlier, and then showing, those parameters based off the treatment, and therefore you can just compare it to your subject device. So it's important to note here, where there are differences in the subject device compared to the state-of-the-art, it's important these differences are discussed in your CER, specifically in your risk-benefit profile acceptability. Okay, so those are it for my slides. Now I will pass it on to Michelle.
So with that, jumping into, we finished our clinical evaluation. We've analyzed the data, and now the ultimate question is, do we have sufficient clinical evidence? And we've found that, a new client comes to us before engaging the notified body, or the client comes to us with queries from the notified body. The answer is often no, we do not have sufficient clinical evidence. Maybe it's because it's not out there, or maybe it's because the data presentation is not sufficient. And clinical evidence is defined in the MDR. It really comes down to whether you have sufficient amount and quality of data to allow for the assessment. And that's, what's referenced here on the slide. The MEDEV actually defines sufficient clinical evidence, which is the amount and quality of clinical evidence to guarantee the scientific validation of the conclusions, in this case of the CER. So when you look at your data set as a whole, it may feel like sufficient data, but when you really get into the weeds of it, there are pieces that are missing. So starting with the bullets here on the slide, these are the ones we commonly see. The first one, data for each device or variant. So using a simplistic example of a trauma plate, let's say you have 2 plate variants, they have different designs or maybe slightly different indications that warrant them to stand alone in the CER. In these cases, the expectation is you have sufficient data to support each variant on their own. If you do not, this may be where equivalence comes into play, but it is a gap. 2 is data on all indications. So sticking with that simplistic example of the trauma plates, let's say the plate is indicated for fracture fixation and osteotomy. The expectation is that there are sufficient data to support each clinical use. Now, there may be opportunities to justify why data from one indication may be able to support another, but it will need to be a strong argument. Mike and I have had successes using justifications, but we have also been told this is not sufficient. So, there's a couple options moving forward from that point, but one of them may be that you have to revise your indication statement. Now, I know I'm giving simplistic examples for the purposes of this presentation, and I recognize that there are complexities and devices out there where the determination of whether data have to stand on their own or not, it's not as straightforward, and it will require sitting down with your cross-functional team and your subject matter experts and thinking strategically on the scientific validity of those justifications. But really, those most conservative reviewers are going to draw a very black and white line here. And similar is the third bullet, data on all anatomical locations. And I think this one catches a lot of our clients off guard, especially if they have a legacy device that's been out there on the market for decades with the same indication statement. And using that trauma plate as an example, these are typically intended to be used throughout the body, the tibia, femur, humerus, clavicle. The expectation is you have data, or maybe a justification, on each of these anatomical locations. We see similar requests for spine files. We've had a request stratified by the indication, and then by single and multi-level use, and then by the actual spinal level treated. So if you have a device indicated for use from L1 to L5, but all your data are on the L4, L5 level, can you really justify use at the L1 to L4 levels? So basically, what are you claiming the device can do, and do you have data to support it? Fourth bullet is the unanswered questions on long-term safety and performance. This is a request we've seen more than once. However, I do not have a definition for you on what long-term is. It varies. There's justification that goes into it, but I will say that you need to consider if you have data to support your full device lifetime. Same line of thinking, but not here in the bullet. We've also had a notified body identify a gap in a scenario where we went in with pre-market clinical investigation data. However, there was a question about the safety and performance of the device in real-world use outside of the rigidity of a clinical trial. And so we had to design a PMCF in this case that would address the question that remained unanswered for the notified body. Last bullet, if you're using equivalent comparator data, then you obviously have at least one device that does not have sufficient data on its own. Now, any of these gaps may be identified, but it doesn't necessarily mean you won't be able to draw the appropriate conclusions and demonstrate conformity with the relevant essential requirements, if we're talking today, or general safety and performance requirements, if we're talking tomorrow, to obtain that CE mark, especially for the legacy devices. However, this is typically a trigger for PMCF, which I'm going to talk about on my next slide. So what's the solution? We need to put together a clinical evaluation per the MEDEV that includes a stratification of the data and really assesses for those gaps. And this leads us to PMCF activities. I think the first thing to note here is that PMCF does not necessarily mean a study. This covers the umbrella of activities that are used to proactively collect and evaluate clinical data from use in humans. When it comes to PMCF today, the gaps that have been called out by notified bodies include you have no PMCF planned when you have some gaps in your clinical evidence, or there is no rationale for not performing a PMCF. You have to have one or the other. Perhaps you have a PMCF proposed, but the sample size is not statistically justified. This is a question you will almost always get, if not. Or there's no PMCF plan documented. So the solutions, first things first, let's complete that clinical evaluation per the MEDEV that assesses for the requirement of PMCF. And this is based on 1, the identified gaps, and 2, the PMCF guidance, MEDEV 2.12/2, which includes a list of circumstances that may justify PMCF. And we utilize both of these strategies in the need for assessing the requirement for PMCF. Then we're going to develop our PMCF plan, including a justification for the planned activities. Like I said, it may not be a full-blown study, but maybe it is. Maybe it is a prospective study, or maybe it's retrospective data collection, a registry design, surveys, CMS data collection, electronic health record review. There are a number of options. However, we have to make sure we're addressing those unanswered questions related to safety and performance. It's not helpful if the data you're collecting is not addressing those questions. And I just want to note that, our MICRA CRO, that team works with companies all the time on adaptive trial designs and really how to get the biggest bang for your buck. We have a great team of statisticians who can help drive sample size justification. And then Mike and I are there in parallel to really give that integrated approach and make sure we're addressing those notified body expectations. Now, I want to talk about post-market surveillance, then risk management, and then how these components of your technical documentation, along with the clinical evaluation, all communicate with each other. The typical gap here in PMS is that the documents just don't exist yet, and they need to be a part of the technical documentation under the MDR. So here I point to Article 83, which really defines your PMS system, but then there are the subsequent articles related to PMS, 84, 85, 86, and then Annex 14 Part B for PMCF that really outline the documents I'm going to touch on. So in summary, the first gap is usually your SOPs and coverage of the MDR requirements. And secondary to that is the supporting documents. And I think the key distinction here is that these need to be in place for each device or device family. Your SOP is not the plan. And those documents are PMS plan, PMS report or periodic safety update report, depending on the risk classification of your device, and then the PMCF plan and the PMCF evaluation report. And all of these are living documents within your quality system. The plan's going to outline how often data are reviewed, what data are reviewed, and then the output of the review is going to be in the report. But also during each review, the plans need to be assessed for any necessary updates based on the results and conclusions. So the solution, we need to update your quality management system to include those SOPs that cover the MDR requirements, as well as the template for the required plans and reports. Again, reminder, this is a May 2021 requirement. So the MDR provides expectations on what should be in the PMS plan and report, as well as the PMCF, but there are also some recently released guidance documents from the Medical Device Coordination Group that outlines templates for the PMCF plan and the PMCF evaluation report. These provide great starting points for building out these documents, and as Mike mentioned, we have a link to those later in the presentation. Moving right along, risk management. So what we typically see here is similar to PMS. It's just a gap in the documentations not being there yet, or appropriate signatures. For whatever reason, the signature one seems to come up in a lot of query reports we've seen. With the MDR, the risk management system is called out as being a requirement, more so than it was in the MDD. But the EU MDR website takes it a step further and really states ISO 14971 is the state of the art for risk management under the new MDR. So if you're aligned with the ISO standard, then you're in pretty good shape. With that being said, the requests we typically see are for a risk management plan and a risk management report. Again, specific to each device or device family. And then I mentioned, making sure we have the appropriate reviews and sign-offs. And then lastly, there needs to be traceability between the risk management and the other technical documents. But I'm really going to dive into that on our next slide. So What should we do? We need to put in place a template for the risk management plan and report. You know, the MDR specifically calls out the risk management plan and then the process for evaluation of the information that's filtered into the risk management and the output of the risk reviews. So in other words, the report, which is not clearly stated in the MDR, but it is in that ISO standard. And then let's also make sure the SOPs are updated to include the MDR requirements and appropriate signatures, including review and sign off by a clinical expert or end user. And I'll take it a step further. We've even had one notified body who said it has to be currently practicing end user. So we'll see where that takes us. And then this takes us to the last topic of the day of traceability. And the gap we typically see is that there is just not clear traceability between the clinical evaluation, risk management, and information supplied by the manufacturer or your labeling. So while not specifically called out here, I do not want you to forget about PMS. Post-market surveillance is very important, and it's typically evaluated within the CER. So it's being accounted for here, but there is also that ongoing regular PMS review that's happening that needs to be filtered into the risk management as well. And so I think historically a lot of these documents were built and maintained independently, but there really needs to be communication between the groups and a process for the input and output of information. So there's really two parts. One, the processes that outline the input and output and how these documents communicate. But then two, the clinical aspect, which is what I have noted here from the MEDEV, which demonstrates that there's consistency between these documents. So what I would first recommend is a traceability assessment. And we typically do this as part of the clinical evaluation process. But it doesn't necessarily have to be done there. It can be done as a separate assessment that gets filtered into the CER, but it does need to be there. Both options work. But in brief, the risks and harms that are identified in our clinical evaluation and PMS should be evaluated for inclusion in the risk management file. And then the residual risks identified in the risk management need to be appropriately provided to users. So if you have new risks that are identified in this current review of the PMS or your current update of the clinical evaluation, we evaluate them. If we determine they're not going to be added to the risk management, we have to have a documentation of the decision and also justification for that decision. So everything's talking and everything's communicating with the appropriate documentation to support it. So just to give, again, probably a simplistic example, but let's say you have identified embolism as a risk in the clinical literature from your clinical evaluation, either on the subject or equivalent device. But embolism is not in your risk documentation, your FMEA, your hazard analysis. We need to assess whether embolism should be added or not. So let's say it came up in several studies in your literature data across several patients. We probably want to consider adding it. It's a new risk that's been identified and it's related to our device and it was not previously considered. Alternatively, let's say the risk came from a single study in a single patient where the authors noted it was related to an error during the procedure. Then we can probably choose not to add it, but we need to document this decision and the justification for the decision, and we have that evidence. Then we take a look at our IFU. So maybe embolism is already there. Maybe you developed the IFU off a similar device's IFU that was already out there and they included embolism, so you included embolism. There's a disconnect there if embolism's in your IFU but not considered in your risk. Or if embolism is not in your IFU but you decide to add it to your risk file, then we need to make sure we take that second step and see if it needs to be added to the IFU and relate to users. So in conclusion, traceability is very important. It comes up in queries in a variety of ways. But ultimately, we need to have those processes in place to show how they're all communicating, and there needs to be consistency in the information. With that, here's just a couple notes on some guidances. There are a number of key guidances that exist. I think we've noted a few of them throughout this presentation. We have the MEDEVs, those related to clinical evaluation and PMCF. We have some of the ISO standards, and then we also have those IMDRF documents that Mike mentioned, specifically related to clinical evaluation and maybe helping you guide you with that appraisal process. We also have a number of guidances that have been published by the Medical Device Coordination Group. These are all specific to the MDR. This is where you can find those guidances on the PMCF templates and the implant card and much more. And that's the first link here. And then there are a number that remain in work. And there is a list that the group has provided of what's coming. So we have some idea and some of them are accompanied by a anticipated date, but those haven't really stood. But that's the second link for your information. So then lastly, key takeaways. There are a number of cross-functional components that require update under MDR. Documents need to communicate with each other. And then as I started the presentation with, there's variability between notified bodies and between reviewers in the same notified body. So it's hard to really get any feel for what is going to work 100% of the time. But the past and ongoing reviews that Mike and I and our team have been a part of really has given us a lot of insight into expectations coming under MDR. So with that, I would say engage your notified body and subject matter experts, with the caveat that notified bodies are very saturated at the moment and it can be challenging to get them to respond. But positive, more and more are being MDR certified. And I have provided a link here as an FYI, the list of those notified bodies that have received that certification. With that, I will say thank you again. Oh, I clicked the link, guys, sorry. Oh. With that, I'll say thank you. The last slide of the presentation has contact information, and I will open the floor up to questions now.
Thank you very much, Michelle. That was fantastic. And yeah, indeed, we do have a little bit of time left, and we do have several questions to get through. So first of all, our first question has been voted. Has McCRA developed any PMCF studies recently that have been reviewed and approved by a notified body?
Yes, we have. The caveat is we're still under MDD, but I think that still carries a lot of weight going into the MDR because really a lot of that's on that identification of gaps and using the PMCF guidance to really drive what will stand. And the notified bodies are accepting it, and I think they're looking forward to the MDR. So I think that really, gives us a lot of ground to stand on what's going to work and what isn't.
Brilliant, thank you. Next question. In terms of collecting clinical evidence for the use of a surgical instrument in different anatomical placements, with the difficulties associated with collecting information in legacy single-use devices, can a PMS or PMCFP be put together to obtain data in the field, e.g. Observing a set number of surgeries in which the device is used?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I got the presentation back up. I'm sorry. I got it, but only about half of it.
No, it was a long and pretty question. Yeah, I'll repeat it. In terms of collecting clinical evidence for the use of a surgical instrument in different anatomical placements, with the difficulties associated with collecting information in legacy single-use devices, can a PMS or PMCFP be put together to obtain data in the field, e.g. observing a set number of surgeries in which the device is used?
Yes, I think that sounds like a fair option. I think the other thing to keep in mind with instruments is depending on the risk level, we definitely have a pathway forward, a performance route or a non-clinical route of conformity, where depending on whether we're doing the MDD or the MDR, the annex that states and justifies this path forward. So yes, there's definitely a lower burden of proof for the instruments, and without knowing the specifics, it sounds like that would be sufficient for sure. Really driving the PMS as your main leverage for demonstrating it's working like it should, it's performing safe and performing as intended, and it's safe. So yeah, definitely.
Brilliant, thank you very much. We have time for one or two more questions. We have one here that's pretty interesting. Will the MEDDEV guidance documents be sufficient for MDR updates, since they are guidance documents for the MDD?
Good question. So yeah, the expectation, especially for the clinical evaluation MEDEV guidance, is that it is pretty aligned with what the expectations are going to be under MDR. I think the PMCF study one still will stand, but it could probably use a little bit more improvement, just because there is this concept that PMCF is not just a study. But as long as you clearly, can understand that PMCF activities is an umbrella, and the MEDEVs, the MEDEV guidance for PMCF is really specific to the studies, but it can help with decision making. I think a lot of the content in those already aligned, if you can kind of just see past the fact that they keep citing the MDD.
Thank you, that's perfect, that's brilliant. Another question, what documents must be up to MDR compliance by May of 2021?
And this is what I had hoped was that it would be, you know, clearly relayed in that first slide Mike did, but again, we had some communication issues. But you know, it really comes down to all of those PMS requirements, including vigilance and trend reporting. And if you could send me that, or maybe we're going to send out something, but we could give you the specific articles really of what that entails. And then, you know, the registration requirements with the caveat that we're not sure exactly what that's going to look like right now with UNIMED. And then the economic operator registration as well. But it really is a lot of that PMS, trend reporting, vigilance reporting, SOPs, and those templates for the plans and reports, and then getting the plans and reports implemented.
Excellent, excellent. One here. Can you include multiple devices with varying risk classes in a single CER?
Oh, and I'll let Mike take this one. If his connection's okay, let's see.
Yeah, is that any better?
That sounded okay, yeah. Let's give it a go.
Yeah, sorry about that earlier. We'll try to re-record my portion and send that out to everybody. But to answer the question, yeah, you can, but I think it's important to look at the risk classes of those devices. If it's a lower risk class, you know, it's a lower threshold of evidence and you're going to update it less frequently. You could have less scrutiny. So it's probably good to create like a mapping file to identify, you know, what data you have to support each device for each risk class, and you know, kind of determine if you want to combine them. I think it's cleaner to have a class 1 separate from a class 2B device, but if you're able to organize one CER, you know, pretty neatly and distinguish between each device, then yeah, there's no rule against combining.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And this one I guess open to either or both of you. It's a slightly broader question, but I think an interesting one. What is the most common piece of advice that you find yourself giving out right now?
Update your clinical evaluation. I know that it seems like a silly one maybe, but even if you have updated it to be Rev 4 compliant, from the Rev 4 CERs that we were doing back in 2016 compared to the Rev 4 CERs we're doing today, they're drastically different. And a lot of that's been driven by the direct notified body feedback we've gotten, and a lot of the tips that we hopefully will be in the slides for you. So yeah, that's definitely one of the most common. That, and then, you know, the clear, trying to find the clear answer to what has to be done by May 2021. And that's that. Really, those PMS documents are kind of the large piece of that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And I believe that is all we have time for. So I want to say a big thank you to all of you for joining us today. And again, a huge thank you to Michelle and Mike for sharing their expertise with you all today. As alluded to, there were some connectivity difficulties around the beginning, unfortunately. However, we will be releasing the slides to all attendees. And moreover, I'm sure both Mike and Michelle will be very, very happy to discuss the contents of the presentation, any ways that they may be able to help you and your business after the webinar, as well as clarify any underdeveloped points or points that were missed. As I mentioned at the start, this is the third and final webinar in the series with McGrath. We will be sending a follow-up email to all of you who are registered as soon as possible, which will include both the presentation and a link to the full recorded webinar. So I want to say once again, a big thank you to all of you for joining us today. And I very much look forward to seeing you all again soon. And once again, thank you very much to Michelle and Mike and McGrath.
Thank you.